Street Fighter, Resident Evil, Mega Man, Monster Hunter, some of gaming's largest, most popular franchises of all time. While they're all quite different from each other in terms of content, these video game juggernauts still have one big thing in common. They are all the creations of Capcom, one of the most prolific and respected companies in the modern gaming market. While Capcom has achieved massive success over the years and built up a catalog of franchises that rivals even their largest competitors, the company originally came from much humbler beginnings. In 1979, IRM Corporation was founded in Osaka, Japan by Kenzo Tsujimoto, also the founder of IREM, a company probably known best for its popular R-Type series. IRM was created with the express purpose of developing and selling electronic game machines in Japan, though not necessarily the same ones as arcade video games like Space Invaders that had just recently begun to take the world by storm. In 1981, the company established a subsidiary named Japan Capsule Computer, and IRM ended up changing its operating name to Sanbi. 2 years after that, in 1983, Tsujimoto formed Capcom, whose name was derived by shortening and combining the words from its previous subsidiary's title, Japan Capsule Computer. It's unclear exactly what games IRM and Sanbi manufactured and distributed in the previous 4 years, but Capcom's first official release was quite different from what they later become known for. It would be an electronic coin-operated arcade game called Little League that lacked any type of screen or monitor and instead functioned by using lights behind a static image. Following Little League's July 1983 release, Capcom would put out a similar coin-op game called Fever Chance just a few months later in October of 1983. As these electronic games were being created and manufactured, the company was looking to bring in some fresh talent that could help create and design new arcade experiences, particularly ones of the now wildly popular video game type. To do this, they would attempt to pull in game designers from one of their biggest competitors, Konami. Konami had found great success in the arcade space with huge hits like Scramble and Frogger that proved just how capable and talented many of their designers and programmers were. Two people in particular had caught Capcom's eye: Kokoro Fujiwara, who had made both Puyon and Rock'n Rope, and Yoshiki Okamoto, the designer of Time Pilot and Gyrus. The company managed to convince both Konami employees to jump ship and bring their arcade video game expertise over to Capcom. At this point, there were roughly 8 developers now at the growing game company. Fujiwara and Okamoto split into 2 teams of 4 and started work on their respective game projects that would slowly begin to form the company's long and successful legacy. Development on these games took place within 2 large rooms on the first floor of a somewhat derelict building that had very warped flooring. One of the rooms was so massive, in fact, that it had previously been used as a practice space by multiple baseball teams if the weather outside was rainy. Fujiwara had been more suited to action games at Konami, with titles like Rock'n Rope, which played much more like a platformer, while Okamoto specialized in STG, or shooting games like Gyrus and Time Pilot. To try and mix things up, the 2 designers decided that Okamoto would create an action game, and Fujiwara would tackle an STG project, an arcade shooter titled Vulgus, or Vulgus as it was known in English. Originally, Vulgus was planned to be Capcom's second video game, but Fujiwara's team ended up completing their project a bit faster than Okamoto's, with development on the game taking roughly 3 months. It would hit Japanese arcades in May of 1984, becoming Capcom's first real step into the video game industry. Vulgus was a vertical shooter that unfortunately lacked the unique and innovative qualities found in many later Capcom titles, taking just a little too much inspiration from Namco's groundbreaking Xevious arcade game, which had been released nearly a year and a half prior by that point. Players would need to maneuver their ship and blast their way through hordes of enemies over the course of 9 stages. The player's ship was equipped with a normal shot and a more powerful cannon shot, which had limited ammunition that could be replenished by picking up flashing POW icons. Much like Xevious, each stage flowed seamlessly into the next, with the same short music track, presumably composed by Capcom's sound designer Ayako Mori, looping over and over non-stop. Even though Vulgus wasn't the most inventive experience, that didn't mean it wouldn't bring anything new to the table. The arcade title introduced a unique mechanic where certain items would appear on screen that affected enemies and their behavior. The S item raised the speed of all enemies, the D item boosted enemy firepower, and the E item increased the amount of enemies appearing on screen. These items would continue to power up and bolster all enemies until they were collected by the player, negating their effect. Ultimately, Vulgus didn't reinvent the wheel and had a tough time standing out in a genre which was becoming very crowded at this point, but it still provided some smooth and enjoyable gameplay that would make Capcom's 1984 debut into the video game market a financial success. This success pushed the title to be brought over to the Western market, and Vulgus would make its way to North America later that same year with SNK as its distributor. Vulgus never received any sequels, though one was announced for the Famicom/NES in 1988 under the title Neo Vulgus in Japan and Titan Warriors in North America. Neo Vulgus' development seems to have reached completion, but it was strangely cancelled last minute by Capcom for unknown reasons. Thankfully, the game has been preserved, and a fully playable ROM of the North American version, Titan Warriors, can be easily found around the internet. Over the years, Vulgus has gone on to be included in many Capcom classic game collections, and has even received some playful references in more recent titles. The arcade shooter also introduced Capcom's signature Yashichi that would be featured as a recurring item in countless of their later games for decades to come, though its initial appearance in Vulgus was that of an enemy. After Capcom's debut title hit arcades, the company's second video game wasn't too far behind. As Capcom's first video game, Vulgus, had been wrapping up development, Yoshiki Okamoto's team remained hard at work creating their new action arcade title. Tokuro Fujiwara's shooter had reached the finish line first, most likely because Okamoto's project had gone through some big changes since its initial concept. Originally, it was supposed to be more in line with experiences like Donkey Kong or Fujiwara's Rock'n' Rope, which were often described as action platformers or character games. But Okamoto's STG roots and love for the genre eventually pushed the title into playing much closer to a horizontal shooter. The project would take heavy inspiration from the famous Chinese novel Journey to the West, with its main character being based on Sun Wukong, one of the leading characters from the renowned story, who was a monkey that possessed supernatural strength and abilities. Sun Wukong's name, when transliterated into Japanese, was pronounced as Son Goku. The game's main protagonist, as well as the game itself, received the name SonSon, obviously inspired by Wukong's Japanese pronunciation, with SonSon being considered Son Goku's grandson instead of the actual character himself. The game began with SonSon's allies being abducted by a Majin, or demon, and the mythical monkey needing to make his way through 19 different stages, each which seamlessly flowed from one to the next, to reach Tenjiku and rescue his captured friends. SonSon's platforming-like mechanic allowed the player to jump vertically back and forth between 6 different rows to avoid hordes of oncoming enemies and collect various point-awarding items. The game also featured a heavy focus on shooting and an auto-scrolling screen, which caused many to classify it as an STG or shoot-'em-up rather than an action platformer. SonSon could fire his magical staff in front of and behind him to defeat both enemies and obstacles, which were often thrown at the player in large droves. At the end of some of the stages, the screen would stop scrolling and a timed challenge area would activate where multiple flashing tablets appeared alongside a group of bomb-hurling enemies. If SonSon destroyed all the tablets within enough time, he'd be rewarded with a special item. This item would be Capcom's signature Yashichi symbol, which was now consciously being included as a branding element for the company, much like Namco's recurring special flag, or S-flag. The Yashichi appeared alongside the screen-clearing POW item, both of which had appeared previously in Vulgus, and would continue to make appearances in many future Capcom games. In SonSon's last few stages, the player received many more opportunities to earn the special Yashichis as the timed challenge areas would start to pop up more frequently. Often following each challenge area would be a short boss fight against 3 of the Majin, who would fly around hurling axe projectiles at the player until they were defeated. Once reaching the statue of Buddha in Tenjiku, the game's final level, and rescuing SonSon's allies, similar to many other arcade titles at this time, the game would loop back around to the very first stage so that the player could continue on using their same credit while still extending their score. SonSon also included simultaneous cooperative gameplay, where a second player would take control of a pig named Tonton, presumably based on the half-human, half-pig character Shubaji from Journey to the West. Both SonSon and Tonton played quite similarly and could work alongside each other, shooting and defeating enemies throughout the game's 19 stages. Okamoto had been a huge fan of and took plenty of inspiration from many of Namco's early arcade works when designing his own games, particularly Xevious. To show his appreciation for the game, he included special bamboo shoot items as an Easter egg in SonSon that were designed after Xevious's Soul Towers. The Soul Towers were hidden targets which would appear only if the player bombed a certain area. Much like these towers, SonSon's bamboo shoots were hidden items that only appeared if the player walked on top of them and could be acquired for points. SonSon would release in Japanese arcades 2 months after Vulgus in July of 1984, achieving somewhat favorable success for Capcom, ranking as the 5th most popular arcade game that month in Japan's Game Machines magazine. It would hit North American shores later that same year, with Romstar handling its distribution in the West. SonSon attracted players with both its fun and unique gameplay and its variety of different enemy types and behaviors. But its floatiness when jumping between the 6 horizontal rows made its controls and movements feel a bit stiff for a game rooted in the STG genre. While some may think Dragon Ball, the insanely popular series that pulled heavy inspiration from Journey to the West as well, might have been a big influence on SonSon's development, the beloved manga wouldn't even receive its first chapter until November of 1984, 4 months after SonSon had initially hit arcades in Japan. In February of 1986, roughly a year and a half following the game's arcade debut, subcontractor Micronix ported the title to Nintendo's Famicom home console. This version had far less floaty movements than its arcade counterpart, but its gameplay was much choppier, which ultimately made it a pretty rough port. After that, a sequel was released in 1989 for the PC Engine exclusively in Japan titled SonSon 2. Surprisingly, it was one of the few PC Engine Capcom games developed completely in-house and fell fully into the platformer genre, being much closer to the original SonSon's initial concept. SonSon has continued to appear regularly in Capcom classic game collections over the years, and even shows up as a playable bonus in titles like Street Fighter VI. In 2005, the arcade game was ported to Japanese mobile phones with one big change. Suisui, one of the allies captured in the opening of the original game, would now be a third fully playable character alongside SonSon and Tonton. The mythical monkey also made plenty of cameo appearances in other Capcom games throughout the years, like Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Pocket Fighter, Zack and Wiki, Resident Evil 6, and Street Fighter Cross All Capcom. Probably the most famous cameo, though, is in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. SonSon is featured as a fully fleshed out character in the iconic fighting game, complete with a unique moveset of special and super abilities. This SonSon is not the same as the one in Capcom's 1984 video game, however, but instead is presumably the granddaughter of that character, and commonly is referred to as SonSon 3 or SonSon the Third. As Okamoto had been preparing SonSon for its arcade release in the summer of 1984, Fujiwara's team was already hard at work designing Capcom's third video game, though it would be a far cry from the vertical shooter he had previously created. Throughout the summer of 1984, Tokuro Fujiwara's team had been working on developing and fleshing out a new arcade title for Capcom. This project deviated heavily from the shooter genre, which the company's 2 previous games had fallen into, and would play much closer to quote-unquote maze games like Pac-Man and Bomberman. The differing genre wasn't the only big change, though. Fujiwara's team decided to go with a much different motif than Vulgus, their previous arcade sci-fi STG, opting for a pirate-themed setting complete with large ship decks and ruthless buccaneers. The project eventually received the title Pirate Ship Higemaru, or often simply just Higemaru. In Japanese, Hige means beard and Maru means round or circle, with the game's title roughly translating to Pirate Ship Beard Round. This might seem like an odd translation, but Japanese merchant ships often have the word Maru added to the end of their names, with Higemaru simply being the name of the ship rather than its literal meaning. In Higemaru, players would take control of the sailor Momotaro, who would confront the titular Higemaru pirate army that was terrorizing the high seas, led by their captain, Baines. The game took place across several stages, referred to as decks in-game, that had barrels arranged around them which formed mazes. The Higemaru pirates would roam around each deck's maze, attempting to trap and defeat the player, with Baines regularly appearing and scouring the levels as well. Momotaro by himself was completely defenseless, but when he approached the barrels that formed each stage's maze, he could pick them up and fling them at oncoming enemies to defeat them. This not only let Momotaro deal with oncoming threats, but also allowed him to alter the layout of a stage at will. Each deck had a certain number of Higemaru pirates the player needed to defeat before being allowed to proceed to the next level. As the game progressed, the pirates would get faster and more aggressive, making things much more difficult in later stages. The pirates often even climbed into barrels and would roam the stage aggressively pursuing the player. Hitting them in this state knocked them out of the barrel and stunned them briefly, giving the player a few seconds to hit them again and finish the job. Thankfully, Momotaro was able to even the playing field a bit by collecting special items uncovered in barrels that acted much like a power pellet in Pac-Man, making him completely invincible and able to defeat a pirate simply by running into them. As had become a standard occurrence now, Capcom's signature Yashichi made its third appearance, showing up as an item that awarded points to the player if they picked it up. As the project proceeded, Fujiwara was exceptionally happy with how the game's 16x16 sprite graphics had turned out, being impressed by just how much personality each character could display. Higemaru completed its summer development and released in Japanese arcades in September of 1984. It's unclear if the game found much success for Capcom due to it never showing up in Japan Arcade Magazine Game Machine's Top 25 list, despite it receiving multiple advertisements in the publication and both Vulgus and SonSon making the cut. Higemaru was never brought to the West and remained exclusive to Japanese arcades, yet another piece of evidence that brought into question the title's financial success. While Capcom's third arcade game had many enjoyable and unique traits that made for a fun experience, it also suffered from somewhat sluggish controls at times, especially when trying to position Momotaro properly in front of barrels or quickly turning a corner when pursued by enemies, which kept the game from being truly memorable. Higemaru remained a Japanese exclusive title for a decade and a half. It was re-released as a part of Japan's Capcom Generations 3 collection in 1998, and finally made its way outside of its native country to Europe the following year in 1999, being included in the PlayStation PAL exclusive multi-disc Capcom Generations compilation. Higemaru eventually made its debut in North America 6 years later, 2 entire decades after its original release, as part of the Capcom Classics collection, and would continue to appear in Capcom compilations in the subsequent years. A sequel to the arcade game titled Higemaru Makaijima Nanatsu no Shima Daibouken was released in 1987 for both the Famicom and MSX2 hardware. Makaijima's gameplay was very similar to its predecessor, but now featured a large focus on exploration. Momotaro could sail his ship around an expansive world filled with multiple islands to traverse and treasures to uncover. While this sequel apparently had been planned to be localized for Western territories by Capcom as Makai Island, those plans were unfortunately cancelled, and Higemaru Makaijima remains exclusive to Japan even today. While a third entry in the Higemaru series never saw the light of day, Capcom's 1993 Super NES game, Goof Troop, based on the hit Disney cartoon, felt very much like a spiritual successor to Higemaru Makaijima. It had very similar gameplay, though with a much bigger focus on puzzle solving, and even featured a pirate ship stage helmed by a crew that looked more than just a little familiar. As has been the case with many Capcom titles, Momotaro and the Higemaru pirates have made cameo appearances in some of the company's later games, including Strider, where the third boss is a pirate named Higemaru Jr., Namco X Capcom, where Sylphie throws barrels in one of her attacks, just like Momotaro, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Ruby Heart's ship crew, Zack and Wiki as mysterious treasures, and Resident Evil 4's 2023 remake, where Momotaro, Bose, and the Higemaru pirates all show up as target dummies in the shooting range. At one point, Momotaro was even supposed to be a playable character in Street Fighter V, but was eventually scrapped for someone else. Though the Higemaru characters do have artwork and information on the online Street Fighter V character guide website. Pirate Ship Higemaru helped show that Capcom could capably make games that weren't all shooters, but after releasing the title in fall of 1984 to what seems like very little fanfare and financial success, the company would pivot back to its STG roots and broaden its focus outside of Japan to the Western gaming market for its first major arcade hit. After releasing 3 games at this point, Capcom had now established a development routine that seemed to be working out for them, with their A and B teams alternating arcade releases to bring in a steady flow of income throughout the year. After SonSon had completed development in July of 1984, Yoshiki Okamoto's team had dived immediately into development of what would be Capcom's 4th video game. Okamoto's new project was a science fiction-like battle game presumably projected to release not too long after Tokuro Fujiwara's pirate ship Higemaru. The team worked hard on the project over the next few months, but when they finally reached the finish line, it became quite clear that this new game had some glaring issues. After going through some internal testing and evaluation, everyone at Capcom all agreed that Okamoto's newest project just wasn't very good. Plus, its generic sci-fi setting and incomprehensible character designs wouldn't help it stand out in arcades. Even the company's own sales department pushed back, saying that they had no desire to try and sell this game to arcades. It was clear to Okamoto and his team that their project was going to receive the axe. Shortly after all this, Kenzo Tsujimoto, Capcom's founder and president, took a few members of the project's development crew to see a movie titled Zero, known as Zerosen Moyu in Japan. Zero took place on the cusp of World War II's outbreak and focused on the test pilot of Japan's new superfighter plane, the Zero. The film inspired Okamoto and his team, and they would restart development on their new project from scratch, completely scrapping their original failed sci-fi arcade game. Once again, Okamoto's love for the STG genre would push him to create yet another shooter, though this time, instead of pulling inspiration from science fiction or a Chinese folktale, he looked to Zero's World War II setting and aircraft for this new game's theme and design, eventually settling on the title 1942. This project would be a vertical shooter in the same vein as Vulgus or Xevious, with the focus on making it a game that was very easy to pick up, understand, and play. Around this time, Capcom had taken notice of the growing popularity of arcade games in the Western market and wanted to create an experience that would appeal specifically to North Americans. Rather than the player taking control of a Japanese plane, Okamoto, who had had a big fascination with American military fiction over the years, decided to flip the script and instead have the player control an American Lockheed P-38 Lightning aircraft that would need to take to the air and shoot down countless Japanese fighter planes. 1942 consisted of 32 stages, which the lone P-38 would need to fight through to defeat Japan and finish the game. Every 4 levels would focus on an actual World War II battle, like the Marshall Islands campaign, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Saipan, and the Battle of Attu, culminating with the Battle of Okinawa for the game's final 4 stages. Each of these levels would throw an onslaught of aircraft and bullets at the player that they'd need to shoot and dodge their way through. At the end of some stages, a boss craft called the Mother Bomber Ayako, named after the game's sound composer Ayako Mori, appeared and pelted the player with bullets until it was defeated. Much like the stages in the game, the Mother Bomber Ayako and many of the enemy planes were based off of actual Japanese World War II aircraft. To help deal with the hordes of enemy fighters and bosses, the player's P-38 came equipped with and could acquire some helpful abilities. The aerial loop could be used to briefly make the player invincible against enemies and bullets, but was limited to a set number of uses, represented by small R sprites, and left the P-38 unable to attack throughout the loop's duration. Capcom's signature POW items appeared once more and could provide the player with certain benefits when picked up, depending on their color. Dark green powered up the P-38's shot, white destroyed all on-screen enemies and bullets, yellow granted an extra aerial loop use, and orange rendered all enemies unable to fire for 15 seconds. For the gray POW item, Okamoto once again pulled inspiration from a previous Namco arcade game. When the item was collected, two side fighters would appear and fly alongside the player's P-38, mimicking its shots, which was a nod to Galaga, where if the player's ship was captured, it could be reclaimed alongside the current ship, effectively doubling the player's firepower until it was destroyed. Now making its fourth appearance, Capcom's signature Yashichi would show up once again as an item that awarded points if the player was able to shoot down a green enemy ship that sometimes snuck onto the screen from the bottom and quickly tried to escape away from the player. Roughly 2 months after Okamoto and his team had scrapped their sci-fi project and started development on 1942, the game finally reached completion and debuted in Japanese arcades on November 30th, 1984. It performed only moderately well at first, competing against Irem's incredibly successful Spartan X, known as Kung Fu Master in the West, which had released just a few days prior. However, 1942's popularity continued to snowball throughout 1985, and the game eventually found massive success, continuing to be a hit in arcades even well into 1986, 2 whole years after its initial debut. While many may wonder how a game based on attacking and defeating Japan's own army found so much success in its native country, it's quite possible that either many of its fans chose to ignore the subject matter due to how fun and addictive its gameplay was, or if the anti-militarism that permeated the country after World War II might have made people more accepting of the game's theme. Regardless, 1942 would be Capcom's first major hit in Japan, pulling in huge profits for the company and establishing them as a major player in the gaming industry. Following its Japanese release, the game made its way to the Western market in mid-1985, once more finding immense success in the regions Capcom had been targeting during its development. While titles like Vulgus and SonSon had found some popularity, 1942 was a game changer. The title's huge success meant that it would receive ports, lots of ports. It would be Capcom's very first home console game published for the Famicom and NES, first releasing in Japan on December 11, 1985, almost exactly a year after its arcade debut. Though it was far from the best and most authentic experience, being developed by subcontractor Micronix, it was still a very big step for Capcom. Aside from the Famicom and NES versions, 1942 also received many PC home ports for various platforms, including the MSX, the Commodore 64, the Sharp X1, the ZX Spectrum, the PC-88, the Amstrad CPC, and the FM7. While some of Capcom's previous titles received a sequel, 1942 would be the first release to become a huge franchise for the company, spawning the highly successful 1940X series of games that included 1943 The Battle of Midway, 1941 Counterattack, and 19XX The War Against Destiny. Like Capcom's earlier games, 1942 was included in many Capcom Classics collections throughout the years. It also received a port for the Game Boy Color by Digital Eclipse and saw a release on the Wii's Virtual Console. In 2008, Capcom released 1942 Joint Strike on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, though this game was really neither a port nor a remake and functioned more as a brand new entry in the 1940X series, despite it using the 1942 name, combining many elements from previous titles in the franchise. As 1984 came to a close, Capcom's first year in the video game market had ended strongly, with 1942 being their biggest release yet. The game would pull the company from being a mid-tier developer to one that could compete with heavy hitters in the game industry like Namco and Konami. Little did Capcom know, though, that 1985 would be an even bigger year for them, introducing groundbreaking new titles which would take the gaming world by storm.